Chapter 8. Misogyny. The origin and effects of the oppression of woman. Women should be subject to their men. The natural order for mankind is that women should serve men and children their parents, for it is just that the lesser serve the greater. Gratian, Decretum, 12th century. In the modern world, misogyny still flourishes, and despite their recent social and political emancipation in many countries, women are still subject to oppression. They may be murdered, raped, trafficked, stoned to death, and brutalized by domestic abuse. Their voice is still marginalized in a world where half the population is female. As previous chapters have explained, we need to go far back into the past to discover the origin of beliefs which have ratified and condoned the oppression and suffering of women, and have become enshrined in religious beliefs and social customs. This chapter will give a more detailed view of the origin of these beliefs and customs and their effects on society. Karen Armstrong, in her book The End of Silence, Women and the Priesthood, shows how the fear of women still influences the theological debates about women being ordained to the priesthood and consecrated as bishops. The Christian view of woman drew on earlier beliefs, which are carried in Jewish commentaries on the myth of the fall, for these were partly responsible for laying the foundation on which later Christian writers built. In the Old Testament we find this key sentence: "Of the woman came the beginning of sin, and through her we all die." Sirach, chapter 25, verse 24. This negative view of woman was carried forward into Christian culture, not through the words or teaching of Jesus, but through the influence of St. Paul, who was brought up in the Jewish faith, and the early Christian fathers. In his letters to the different churches, St. Paul instructed women to keep their heads covered, not to teach or speak in the church, and to be subject to their husbands in all things. For man is not of woman, but woman of the man. Neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 8 to 14, Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 to 4, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 7 to 9, and 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 34 to 5. This was one root of the negative view of woman that was developed in Christianity. But there was another, derived from the ideas that prevailed about women in the Greek world, as reflected in Plato's theory of eternal forms. In this theory, as Jack Holland explains in his book Misogyny, the World's Oldest Prejudice, the very act of conception is viewed as a falling away from the perfection of God into the abysmal world of appearance, of suffering and death. This dualistic vision of reality denigrated the world of the senses, placing it in an eternal struggle with the achievement of the highest form of knowledge, the knowledge of God. This vision profoundly influenced Christian thinkers in their view of women, who literally, as well as figuratively, embodied what is scorned as transient, mutable, and contemptible. Apart from philosophical theories, there were also social customs. In her book, When Women Were Priests, Karen Jo Torgerson brilliantly illuminates how the Christian fathers absorbed their view of the different roles of men and women from the social customs of the Roman Empire, and how these, in turn, were inherited from those that existed in Greek culture. It seems incredible to discover that views about women which still prevail today can be traced back to these ancient cultures. As she writes, "When women are dismissed as irrational, and men are presumed to be innately logical, we can be sure these conclusions are prompted by the persistent whisperings of long-dead Greek philosophers in society's ear." Torgerson explores the root of these beliefs, for they were strongly held convictions which influenced a whole society. She explains that the Greek theory held that the human self has two aspects: a superior masculine self, rational, virile, masterful, and noble, and an inferior feminine self that is irrational, sexual, animal, and potentially dangerous. Enshrined within this theory of the self are the gendered values of male honor and female shame. Masculinity, equated with sexual and political dominance, is designated rational. By identifying the sexual, appetitive, and dangerous aspects of the self as irrational, the philosophers split off the uncontrollable parts of human nature and projected them onto a lower female self. Through this gendering of the self, femaleness became the primary symbol for the irrational and uncontrollable. Women could then be labeled irrational, sensual, and dangerous because of the supposed dominance of their lower female nature and weakness of their higher masculine self. And, she observes, these negative beliefs about woman's nature were transmitted to Christianity. Instead of celebrating femaleness as providing a unique avenue of access to God, or seeing in femaleness a profound expression of the divine, Christianity left the traditional cultural meanings of femaleness and female sexuality unchanged. Rationality and self-control retained their masculine cast, while passion, sexuality, and body are particularly female. Woman's body, since it was a stark proclamation of sexuality, was not in the image of God. It represented rather the pull of those forces that drew humanity away from God. Putting the Greek and Roman inheritance together with Jewish beliefs about the sin of the fall and the shame of sexuality created a dual legacy, which was to have a disastrous impact on women's psyche and women's lives in Christian culture. The role of women in the early church. It is therefore all the more astonishing to discover that in the first 2 centuries after the death of Jesus, women played a valuable and valued public role in the early church. To begin with, Christianity was disseminated through meetings in the houses of individuals, many of them distinguished and wealthy women, well respected in their community. When they were baptized as Christians, their whole household, including slaves, was baptized with them. Women preached, taught, baptized, and performed healings and exorcisms in the earliest Christian community. Women were attracted to Christianity because it gave them a freedom and respect that they were not accorded in the surrounding culture, whether Jewish, Greek, or Roman. For the first time, they had choice in the disposal of their bodies. They could choose to abstain from marriage by remaining virgins, or to be celibate within marriage, and, through sexual abstinence, could refrain from having children, or additional children if they so chose. Marriage was for life. A wife could not be put aside. Infidelity in a man was regarded as sinful as it was in a woman. These ideas were provocative and shocking in the world of that time. Jesus' attitude towards women was truly revolutionary, because in the way he treated them, he broke with Jewish as well as Roman custom. His disciples were surprised by his empathic attitude towards women, as when he spoke with the Samaritan woman, John chapter 4, verse 27, and when he shocked the Pharisees by rescuing a young woman from being stoned to death for adultery, John chapter 8, verses 3 to 11. Women surrounded Jesus during his ministry, invited him into their houses, and generally seemed to have been welcomed by him as disciples and friends. Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Perhaps the closest of these women was Mary Magdalene. Her relationship with Jesus holds an increasing fascination for modern women, as the many books written about her and the phenomenal success of the Da Vinci Code attest. In Christian teaching, Mary Magdalene has been presented as the penitent whore, a prostitute who was rescued by Jesus from a life of sin and who had 7 devils cast out of her. But there is now more than enough evidence to show that this was a calumny fixed onto Mary by a misogynistic church obsessed with the sin of sexuality and determined to protect Jesus from the taint of a close physical relationship with a woman. Nothing reveals the split between soul and body more than the idea that it was inconceivable that the Son of God could have sexual relations with a woman. Divine love had to exclude sexual love, because sexual love was impure and a transmitter of the sin of the fall. In order to fulfill the role of the Redeemer, the Saviour had to be chaste and undefiled. He could not be allowed to transmit original sin through the sexual act, nor could he even be conceived through the sexual act. In a most interesting book called The Meaning of Mary Magdalene, published in 2010, an Episcopalian priest called Cynthia Bourgeau, in a careful analysis of this derogatory view of Mary and an exploration of the text of the Gnostic Gospel of Mary, has given the clearest description of the extraordinary depth and spiritual quality of the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, a relationship that she believes is at the heart of the Christian story, a spiritual love so refined and numinous as to be virtually unknown in the West today. Mary's role as spiritual companion of Jesus need not exclude an erotic relationship between them. In the Gospel of Philip, there is this oft-quoted passage, "And the companion of the Saviour is Mary Magdalene. But Christ loved her more than all the disciples, and used to kiss her often on the mouth." This apparently offended the other disciples, who complained in this Gospel, and in the Gospel of Mary, that Jesus loved her more than them. There is no reason, other than the conviction of the Christian fathers that the Son of God had to be celibate, to exclude the possibility that he had a close relationship with Mary Magdalene, who obviously loved Jesus deeply, and who, we are told, stood with another woman, also called Mary, at the mouth of his tomb after his burial. Matthew chapter 28, verse 61. The Gospel of John gives the clearest description of her later returning to the tomb, and of how, finding the stone rolled away from it, she ran to find Peter and another disciple who hurried back with her to see for themselves what had happened. All four Gospels mention Mary by name as the first person to witness the resurrection, and also the first to inform the other disciples of what had happened. Cynthia Bourgeau concludes that the fact that the canonical Gospels describe Mary Magdalene by name as the premier witness to the resurrection suggests that among the earliest Christians, the stature of Mary Magdalene is of the highest order of magnitude, more so than even the Virgin Mother. Mary Magdalene's place of honor is so strong that even the heavy hand of a later male-dominated ecclesiology cannot entirely dislodge it. She explains further, "The high position she held among the close followers of Jesus is more explicitly shown in the Gnostic Gospels, where Mary Magdalene is seen as the first among the apostles, not because she was the first on the scene at the resurrection, but in a more fundamental way, because she gets the message. Of all the disciples, she is the only one who fully understands what Jesus is teaching and can reproduce it in her own life. Her position of leadership is earned, and it is specifically validated by Jesus himself." What precisely was this teaching? It was, Bourgeau concludes, a teaching which belonged to the tradition of conscious self-transformation, which is specifically carried in the three Gnostic Gospels of Thomas, Philip, and Mary. Whereas the canonical Gospels emphasize right belief as the basis for salvation, these three wisdom Gospels all place their emphasis on right practice. In her view, there is no doubt that what Jesus and Mary Magdalene were both teaching was the methodology of right practice. This practice could, in time, lead to the opening of the eye of the heart, an organ of spiritual perception which, as Borgia wonderfully describes it, acts like a vibrant, resonant field, aligning us with a deeper dimension of reality, bringing together the finite and the infinite, so that we act from the underlying unitive ground, that place of oneness before the opposites arise. That Mary was the partner and sole companion of Jesus in this shared work would seem to be confirmed in the Gospel of Mary, and also in the Gnostic dialogue of the Saviour, where Mary is described as the woman who knew the all. It is also confirmed by a 3rd century text, the Pistis Sophia, where Mary takes the main questioning and teaching role in a long dialogue with Jesus. Here, as in the Gospel of Mary, Peter registers his irritation with Mary's closeness to Jesus and the fact that he imparted to her teachings that were not given to the other disciples. The contamination of original sin. As church doctrine developed, particularly after the Council of Ephesus in AD 431, when the Virgin Mary was declared Theotokos, or God-bearer, it was decided that she, as well as her son, could not be contaminated by original sin. The fact that Jesus had brothers and sisters before him was expunged from the record, in order that Mary, as the mother of the Saviour, should be a sexually pure recipient of the Holy Spirit. For, if his mother had been defiled by sexual intercourse, and Jesus born in the normal way, like his brothers and sisters, he would have been contaminated by original sin, and could not, therefore, have been the Son of God. The sexually explicit distinction between Mary and other women had to be clearly drawn. She was to remain a virgin before, during, and after birth of her son. From the papal edict of 1854, she became the immaculately conceived, as well as the immaculately conceiving, Virgin Mary. This effectively elevated Mary to the status of an archetype, removing her from the sphere of earthly womanhood. This process was completed with the papal bulls of 1950 and 1954, when Mary was received, body and soul, into heaven and named Queen of Heaven. Returning to the reason why Jesus had to be celibate, Cynthia Borgia comments, "It gives one a bit of a start to realize that for the better part of 2 millennia, Christian theology has been written, shaped, formulated, and handed down almost exclusively by celibates talking to other celibates. And from this exclusively celibate template emerges the only image of Christ our tradition has allowed us to entertain, of a celibate renunciate whose sinless purity would necessarily entail sexual abstinence. The effects of this derogatory manipulation of the sexual instinct are still with us today, as she explains. Because it has been so thoroughly programmed into us that celibacy is the highest Christian way, and that committed spousal love is a second-rate path or no path at all, it is hardly surprising that our Western anthropology of human sexuality is abysmal. In the secular version, relentlessly foisted upon us by contemporary culture, it's all about pleasure, performance, gratification. In the bedrooms of the faithful, it's still all too often about duty and shame, a begrudging debt to future generations, which is still tainted with carnal sin. Mention erotic love, and people will immediately hear sex, then, immediately thereafter, dirty. The idea that there could be anything holy about this kind of love is too alien to even consider. We are all children of a cultural stream whose vision of human love has been shaped by the shadow side of celibate spirituality. The defective nature of woman. There was a marked change in the attitude towards women in the 3rd and 4th centuries, when Christian theologians, many of them originally lawyers, began to inveigh against women holding any priestly office or even speaking out in debates in church, for by now churches had been built to hold large congregations. Once again, as in Greek and Jewish culture, women were relegated to the home and could hold no public office, with the exception of those women in Greek and Roman culture who held the role of priestesses. Their primary role was to copy Mary's example of humility and accept the rule of chastity, silence, and obedience. As Irenaeus, circa AD 125 to 200, Bishop of Lyons, stated, Eve, by her disobedience, brought death on herself and on all the human race. Mary, by her obedience, brought salvation. The power of men to control the lives of women was never questioned. Tertullian, AD 160 to 220, a theologian and prolific writer living in North Africa, became one of the most vociferous critics of women holding priestly office. It is not permitted for a woman to speak in the church, nor is it permitted for her to teach, nor to baptize, nor to offer the Eucharist, nor to claim for herself a share in any masculine function, least of all in priestly office. Tertullian addressed women directly in one of the most virulently misogynistic passages that have come down to us from the past. By every garb of penitence, woman might the more fully expiate that which she derives from Eve, the ignominy, I mean, of the first sin, and the odium of human perdition. Do you not know that you are each an Eve? You are the devil's gateway. You are the unsealer of that forbidden tree. You are the first deserter of the divine law. You destroyed so easily God's image, man. On account of your desert, that is death, even the Son of God had to die. Today, we would say that he was in the grip of a complex. Despite the fact that in the Gospels Jesus does not equate sexuality with sinfulness, but, on the contrary, protects an adulterous woman from death by stoning, the idea of enmity between the higher, soul and rational mind, and lower, body, aspects of human nature, and the sinfulness of sexuality, became, through the influence of St. Augustine and later theologians, one of the major themes of Christian teaching. Generations of Christian ascetics believed that the path to God could only be opened through the renunciation of anything to do with the contamination of woman, because that contamination might defile the holy sacraments and interfere with their contemplation of God. After his conversion, St. Augustine wouldn't allow any woman in his house, not even his elder sister or his nieces, all of whom were nuns. He said that woman's face reminded him of Eve. In our research for Chapter 13 of The Myth and the Goddess on the dark legacy of the myth of the Fall, which gives a much fuller account of this legacy, Jules and I found endlessly repeated in the writings of the Christian theologians that woman, because of her descent from Eve, was described as an inferior substance because Eve emerged from Adam, as a secondary creation because Eve was created second out of Adam, as the ally of the serpent and the devil because she succumbed to temptation first, as the devil's gateway through whom the devil or Satan is enabled to pursue his aims in the world through causing her to tempt men into sexual relations. These ideas laid the ground for the witch trials over 1,000 years later, when women were specifically accused of consorting with the devil and even having intercourse with him. The fact that Eve in Genesis is described as a secondary creation drawn from the body of Adam, rather than a primary creation, led to this contorted statement from Gratian, a 12th century theologian, which reinforced the idea that women should be under the control of their husbands, and went so far as to state that woman was not made in God's image because she was a secondary creation, drawn from Adam. The image of God is in man, and it is one. Women were drawn from man, who has God's jurisdiction, as if he were God's vicar, because he has the image of the one God. Therefore woman is not made in God's image. Adam was beguiled by Eve, not she by him. It is right that he whom woman led into wrongdoing should have her under his direction, so that he may not fail a second time through female levity. The end result of these negative projections onto woman was that Eve and all women were equated with body, matter, and carnality, and the irrational nature of man. Adam, who got off relatively lightly as a primary creation and as a secondary rather than a primary sinner, was equated with the rational soul, following the Greek view of man. Woman, wrote Albertus Magnus, teacher of Thomas Aquinas in the 12th century, is an imperfect man and possesses, compared to him, a defective and deficient nature. She is therefore insecure in herself. That which she herself cannot receive, she endeavours to obtain by means of mendacity and devilish tricks. No wonder it has been so difficult for women priests and women bishops to gain acceptance. Here are two statements from the pen of St. Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 1274, who was influenced not only by Albertus Magnus, but by Aristotle's derogatory view of woman. As regards the individual nature, woman is defective and misbegotten, for the active force in the male seed tends to the reduction of a perfect likeness in the masculine sex, while the production of woman comes from a defect in the active force, or from some material indisposition, or even some external influence, like the south wind, for example, which is damp. The image of God in its principal signification, namely the intellectual nature, is found in both man and in woman. But, in a secondary sense, the image of God is found in man and not in woman, for man is the beginning and end of woman, as God is the beginning and end of every creature. In 1130, a well-known French poet, Bernard of Cluny, in a poem called De Contemptu Mundi, contrasted the heavenly world of beauty, light, and peace with this fallen one that was contaminated by woman. Woman for him was the symbol of a transient and corrupt nature, dragging men down to damnation. He was much praised for giving such vivid expression to a then widely accepted belief. Woman, sordid, perfidious, fallen, besmirches purity, meditates impiety, corrupts life. Woman is a wild beast. Her crimes are like the sand. Woman is a guilty thing, a hopelessly fleshly thing, nothing but flesh, vigorous to destroy, born to deceive, and taught to deceive. The last pitfall, worst of vipers, beautiful rottenness, a slippery pathway, public doorway, sweet poison. All guile is she, fickle and impious, a vessel of filth, an unprofitable vessel. The sins of a man are more pious, more acceptable to the Lord, than the good deeds of a woman. The misogynistic attitude towards women that prevailed in Greek and Roman culture had distant roots in the dualism of the solar age, where light and darkness, good and evil, are so strongly polarized. The subservient position of women in those cultures, where the solar ethos prevailed, was the same as it was to become in later Christian and other patriarchal cultures. It was found not only in the Semitic cultures of the Near and Middle East, and in Greek and Roman culture, but also further to the east, in cultures such as those of India and China. Wherever a powerful controlling male priesthood, allied to social custom, assigned and enforced a subservient position on women. These ideas, which reflected and confirmed those imbibed from Greek and Roman, as well as Jewish culture, entered mainstream Christian teaching and were responsible for an enormous amount of suffering for woman, whose inferior and sexual nature came to be seen as the main impediment standing between man and God. It is as if a spell were cast on the Christian psyche by the myth of the fall. Torgerson summarizes woman's position. The equation of woman with sexuality and body, and the exclusion of sexuality and passion from the divine, opened up a chasm between woman and God. Only by repudiating her sexual identity and renouncing femaleness could this chasm be bridged. The equation of woman with sexuality meant she was both subordinated to man and alienated from God. The beliefs and social customs engendered by these projections justified every kind of persecution of woman, from denying her the right to any property and making her subject to her husband, to the witch trials of the 15th to 18th centuries, in which many thousands of women were tortured, their head and genitals shaved, so that no devil might conceal himself in their hair, in order to prove their sexual relations to the devil. Many died horrifically at the stake. The exact number varies with different authors. Many of these unfortunate women were accused of being witches by other women in their communities. In 1485, Pope Innocent VIII published a bull that was followed by the publication in 1487 of the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of the Witches, inaugurating centuries of persecution. This became the handbook of the Inquisition and led to the torture and murder by death at the stake or by hanging of thousands of so-called witches, many of whom were midwives skilled in the use of herbs for healing. Never, writes Gregory Zilborg in his History of Medical Psychology, in the history of humanity was woman more systematically degraded. She paid for the fall of Eve sevenfold, and the law bore a countenance of pride and self-satisfaction, and the delusional certainty that the will of the Lord had been done. Carrying the cellular memory of such deeply negative projections onto her, as well as the terror arising from this persecution, it has been immensely difficult for women to find their voice and their true role in society, and for men to overcome their fear and distrust of, and even their contempt for women. Misogyny, an ongoing legacy. We can trace this negative view of woman right the way through the Middle Ages, where she was presented as the flawed, moral, and intellectual inferior of man, and can find it reflected in the prestigious Roman de la Rose that was widely read in the 14th century. We can listen to the baffled protest of a highly educated woman, Christine de Pizan, who was familiar with this book, writing her own, the Book of the City of Ladies, at the beginning of the 15th century. Sitting at her desk one day, and leafing through yet another tract full of hatred and virulent condemnation of women, an extraordinary thought became planted in my mind, which made me wonder why on earth it was that so many men had said and continue to say and write such awful, damning things about women and their ways. It is not just a handful of writers who do this. It is all manner of philosophers, poets, and orators, too numerous to mention, who all seem to speak with one voice and are unanimous in their view that female nature is wholly given up to vice. I dwelt on these thoughts at such length that it was as if I had sunk into a deep trance. I came to the conclusion that God had surely created a vile thing when he created woman. This thought inspired such a great sense of disgust and sadness in me that I began to despise myself and the whole of my sex as an aberration in nature. Sunk in these unhappy thoughts, my head bowed as if in shame, and my eyes full of tears, I sat slumped against the arm of my chair, with my cheek resting on my hand. At this point, Christine received a vision or a visitation from 3 majestic women who said that they had come to encourage her to write a book that would offer support to all women, for the female sex has been left defenseless for a long time now, like an orchard without a wall, and bereft of a champion to take up arms in order to protect it. Following this encouragement, Christine says, she began to write her book. Misogyny and Medical Attitudes and Practices. Quite apart from social attitudes which, for centuries, barred women access to education, their professions, and a role in political life, misogynistic attitudes were carried through into the 19th century in the medical treatment of women's emotional and physical symptoms. Medical opinion in 19th century Europe held that the clitoris was an important source of mental and physical disease, as well as hysteria. The initial practice was to apply leeches to the vulva and anus, and to cauterize the clitoris. The first known therapeutic function of X-rays was to irradiate and destroy the clitoris in these women. One can only imagine the excruciating pain women suffered at the hands of these physicians. But these assaults on the female genitalia were superseded by the fashion for clitoridectomy from the 1860s, as Professor John Studd, a contemporary gynecologist, explains in a talk given to the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists in May 2011. The 19th century medical attitude to normal female sexuality was cruel, with gynecologists and psychiatrists leading the way in designing operations for the cure of the serious contemporary disorders of masturbation and nymphomania. The gynecologist Isaac Baker Brown, 1811 to 1873, and the distinguished endocrinologist Charles Brown Séquard, 1817 to 1894, advocated clitoridectomy to prevent the progression to masturbatory melancholia, paralysis, blindness, and even death. Even after the public disgrace of Baker Brown in 1866-7, the operation remained respectable and widely used in other parts of Europe. This medical contempt for normal female sexual development was reflected in public and literary attitudes, or perhaps it led and encouraged public opinion. There is virtually no novel or opera in the last half of the 19th century where the heroine with a past survives to the end. H.G. Wells's Anne Veronica and Richard Strauss's Der Rosenkavalier, both of which appeared in 1909, broke the mold and are important milestones. We are horrified by the practice of female genital mutilation that is widespread in different cultures, particularly in parts of Africa, but not long ago we did not perceive the barbarity of what was accepted medical practice in Europe. Astonishingly, in the 1980s, the School of Tropical Medicine in London was still instructing students on how to perform this operation. Female genital mutilation, FGM, was being inflicted on young girls of foreign origin in the United Kingdom until attention was recently drawn to this fact. Up to 100,000 women living in the UK are thought to have undergone this genital mutilation, and 24,000 more may be at risk, 2012. This abhorrent practice has now been declared illegal for British citizens, whether in the United Kingdom or abroad, and carries a prison sentence of up to 14 years. Elsewhere, however, up to 140 million, mainly Muslim women worldwide, have, as little girls, endured the torture and risk of infection caused by female genital mutilation, often performed without an anesthetic by their mothers and grandmothers. The psychological as well as the physical trauma suffered by little girls who are forced to submit to the pain of this torture is unimaginable. The memory of the betrayal in the interests of social custom by the people whom they loved and who they believed loved them will be carried in the psyche for the rest of their lives. The oppression of women in Muslim societies. So deeply embedded in patriarchic culture are the beliefs developed in the Solar Era about the dangerous sexuality of women that we can still find them reflected in Muslim cultures, wherever women are confined to the home, denied access to education, and forbidden to take up a profession. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, in her books Infidel and Nomad, has, with immense courage, told the story of her rebellion against the suffocating role assigned to her as a young woman in Somalia, and her escape from an oppressive tribal society to the intellectual and social freedom of the secular West, and eventually to America, where she still needs protection from those who threaten her with death because of her betrayal of Islam. The persecution of women under the Taliban in Afghanistan is now well known, but there are other Muslim countries such as Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, and even Turkey, where these social attitudes prevail and where women are considered to be the property of their fathers and husbands, and still have no rights, or very limited ones. In Pakistan in 2011, almost 1,000 women and girls were murdered by their fathers, husbands, or brothers in honor killings, often covered up by the police. From the Report on Human Rights Commission of Pakistan, 2012. Between 2000 and 2011, 4,400 women were murdered in Turkey, and 42% of women admit to suffering sexual or physical abuse. The country is 122nd out of 135 in the United Nations 2011 Gender Equality Index. From the Times, 28th January 2012. Even in the United Kingdom, young women in Muslim communities originating in Pakistan have been forced to marry complete strangers, even first cousins. So strong is the taboo on infringing the honor of the family that some have been murdered by their fathers and brothers for daring to marry someone outside the family's choice of a husband. A recent trial, July 2012, sentenced a mother and father to life imprisonment for murdering their eldest daughter because she had brought shame on their family. Only in June 2012 was there finally a move to make forced marriages illegal and to rescue the many young girls taken to Pakistan against their will and forced to marry a man chosen by their families. The despicable custom of stoning women to death for adultery is recorded in the Old Testament and existed in the time of Jesus, as the story about him intervening to prevent it illustrates. But stoning to death under Sharia law is still an accepted practice in Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Sudan, Iran, Yemen, and the United Arab Emirates and parts of Nigeria. And there have also been reported instances of this in Afghanistan and Somalia. Sakina Mohammadi Ashtiani would have died in this manner if an outraged world had not protested. One of the lawyers who defended her case is still in prison. An Afghan woman recently had her nose and ears cut off and was left for dead on a freezing hill. Her crime? She had dared to leave her abusive husband, 2010. She was rescued by villagers and helped to escape to America, where she has had reconstructive surgery. Her father has been threatened with death because he committed the unpardonable sin of allowing his daughter to find refuge with unbelievers, and had therefore shamed his community. Asia Bibi, a Christian Pakistani woman, is in prison 2011 under threat of death for blasphemy, for daring to ask to drink from the same bucket as other women in her village, having asked them what benefit Islam had brought to those as poor as she. Her case led to 2 political assassinations of men who spoke out against the blasphemy laws in Pakistan, one of them the governor of the Punjab. The recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan have accomplished one positive thing. They have revealed to the eyes of the world the appalling suffering and oppression of women in Islamic societies, even if they haven't put an end to it. Ayaan Hirsi Ali's own words offer the best testimony to the roots of this oppression. Virginity is the obsession, the neurosis of Islam. Wherever there is a Muslim community, forced or coerced marriage, even child marriage, is common, even in families who are relatively educated. Like domestic violence, most people consider it normal. Men are the guardians of their daughters. A girl is therefore the property of her father, who is entitled to transfer that property to the husband he selects. She compares the liberation of women to a vast unfinished house. The west wing of the house is in reasonably good order, and women in this wing enjoy the right to vote and run for office, have access to education, and enter any number of professions. Domestic violence, sexual harassment, and rape are recognized in law as crimes for which the perpetrator is held accountable and punished. Women have access to contraception and therefore to reproductive rights over their bodies and their sexuality. But in the East Wing, it is a different story. The work is unfinished, even abandoned, and parts of it are falling into ruin. The lives of women are harsh. They can be beaten and even murdered by their families and husbands without real redress in law. They cannot go out unaccompanied by a male relative. Thousands of young women die while giving birth because they have no access to the most basic hygiene and medical care. The story of the liberation of women from their millennia-long oppression is unfinished. Centuries may pass before the building of the Eastern House can be completed and the remaining anomalies in the Western House removed. The Decree of the Catholic Church, 2010. Even in the West Wing, the house is not finished. Returning to Christianity, the latest decree of the Catholic Church relating to women, July 2010, elevates the ordination of women to one of the most serious crimes in canon law, putting it on the same level as child abuse in the eyes of the Church. It is truly incredible that anyone ordaining a woman into the priesthood should be excommunicated by an office that was formerly the source of the Inquisition. How is it possible that something so grossly offensive to women could have passed into canon law? We may wonder how it is conceivable in this day and age, when women have begun to grow into their true potential against the virulent opposition of both church and state, for the Catholic Church, governed entirely by celibate males, to make such a preposterous ruling. To believe that God would want things to continue as they have done for centuries, marginalizing women and barring them from expressing their great gifts of compassion and empathy in the service of the sacred, is to assume that the Catholic Church has privileged access to God's heir, an inflated and absurd position. In the Anglican Church also, a number of priests have declared their opposition to women bishops and are joining the Catholic Church. Karen Armstrong, in the last paragraph of her book, The End of Silence, Women and Priesthood, concludes, "Present attitudes of misogyny and unresolved conflicts must be brought out into the open, and the pain experienced by women within the churches must also be addressed. It will be a long, hard road, but there is no alternative if the profound disorders and injustices of the past are to be healed." From a Jungian perspective, the phobic fear of woman in patriarchal culture reflects the fear of the evolving organ of consciousness, the ego, being swallowed up by the primordial, undifferentiated unity, the maw or womb of nature. Woman herself was unconsciously identified with that all-devouring maw. The sin of Eve proved her untrustworthiness. For men who are deeply insecure in their masculinity, who have never had a mature relationship, let alone a sexual relationship with a woman, whose internalized image of woman is undeveloped because woman has never been valued for herself, but only for the service she can render to man, an independent and educated woman, and, God forbid, an ordained woman, will present a threat. unconsciously the threat of castration and death. The long-term effects of the myth of the fall. Generations of Christian men and women have sat in church listening to the story of the fall, absorbing it as the word of God and as divinely revealed truth. How were they affected by it? How has it programmed man's unconscious attitude towards woman, sexuality in general, and woman's view of herself? It is possible that the violent patterns of behavior in society we still encounter, from murder, rape, trafficking, domestic violence against women, as well as pornography and the sexual abuse of children, have their roots in the interpretation given to this myth. According to recent statistics posted on the Internet, the most conservative estimates suggest that worldwide, 2 to 4 million women of all races and classes are battered by their partners each year. In the United States, over 1,000 women are murdered by their partners every year. In the United Kingdom, over 100 women a year are murdered by their partners or husbands. Domestic violence accounts for 23% of all violent crime, and this is increasing, 2012. The trauma inflicted on children by domestic violence cannot be quantified, but calls to Childline in 2011 have increased by a third in 5 years. Thousands of children run away from their homes each year or are taken into care. Many of these are inducted into sexual slavery on the streets of our cities, as the horrific case of young girls groomed and repeatedly raped by Pakistani men in Rochdale, May 2012, and Rotherham, September 2012, illustrates. The number of rapes in domestic situations, on city streets and in war, is not known but is huge. The latest scandal, involving the abuse of young women and girls, has focused on the evidence that has emerged about the behavior of Jimmy Savile, now a disgraced hero. While these figures cannot be attributed exclusively to the influence of religious indoctrination, nevertheless, I believe that over the centuries this has laid the ground for the infliction of intolerable violence and degradation on woman. There is another aspect to the contempt for women reflected in the tragic fate of the millions of young women who are trafficked as sex slaves. Worldwide estimate is 4 million. Millions of women from poorer countries in Eastern Europe, Asia, Africa, and South America are being forced, for their survival or in the hope of a better life, to enter into prostitution and even slavery, because there is a market for sex among men who still see women as sexual objects to be exploited and subjugated, thereby perpetuating the pattern of male dominance over them. Duped into believing that they will find employment in the richer countries, they travel to them only to find their passports confiscated by the men who have trafficked them. They become virtual prisoners, unable to escape from this vile trade. What unconscious negative beliefs about herself might woman in every culture carry as a result of the silent suffering and outright persecution she has endured for millennia? What unconscious misogynistic beliefs do men still hold which allow them to injure, rape, and murder women in this way? 50,000 mainly Muslim women were raped in the Bosnian War, 400,000 in Rwanda, an unquantifiable number of women and young girls in Darfur and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Rapes are currently an intrinsic part of the appalling sufferings of civilians in Syria. Women who are raped are regarded as contaminated. They are shamed and ostracized by their communities, rejected by their husbands and families, and traumatized for life. Only a minute handful of men responsible for these rapes are convicted of this crime, because rape has always been regarded as a legitimate weapon of war.
The effects on children. Generations of children have sat in church and Sunday school and been imprinted with the idea that long ago a woman disobeyed God and succumbed to the temptation of the serpent, bringing sin, death, and suffering into the world, and that her suffering and even her death in childbirth were a punishment for that original sin. They also learned that Eve tempted Adam to eat the apple from the tree of knowledge, and so was to blame for his fall and his being forced to toil for his living. How, I wondered, would this myth have influenced children's view of their mothers and fathers and their own developing sexuality? Suppose their mother died in childbirth, how would this myth have affected their memory of her? How did it influence the attitude of boys towards girls and girls' view of themselves? It has surely contributed to women's deep unconscious feeling of inferiority. In both men and women, it would have set up a great conflict in their nature, making them distrustful of their instincts and guilty about sex, believing that this vindictive, punishing, angry God demanded the repression or even the sacrifice of their sexuality as an expiation for the contamination of their inherited sin and as a kind of guarantee of their spirituality. Again, how has the myth of the fall affected Christian attitude towards children? Generations of children had sin and evil beaten out of them, lest they should fall into the clutches of the devil. Masturbation not long ago was regarded as a sin and severely punished. Many thousands of children have suffered terrible trauma at the hands of priests and nuns. The repellent accounts of the sadistic punishments meted out by these celibate servants of God are only just coming to light in recently published reports in Ireland, the Ryan and Murphy reports 2009 and the Cloyne report 2011, as well in accounts of the abuse inflicted by the Catholic Christian Brothers and Sisters of Mercy on orphan children sent to Australia at the beginning of the last war. In the Jamie Bulger case, 1993, where two 10-year-old boys tortured and murdered a toddler, people wrote to the Times in England saying that all children were born sinful and were therefore likely to be programmed to do evil. All this seems outrageous and also tragic because it was so completely unnecessary. It boils down to shocking indoctrination over many hundreds of years. As a therapist and as a woman, I have been made deeply aware of the misogyny in the culture as a whole and the guilt women carry, as well as men's unconscious fear of and contempt for women, and women's fear and distrust of men, as well as their inability to value and respect their bodies. I can see clearly that these stem, at least in part, from the calamitous legacy of the later as well as the early Christian fathers, for Luther and Calvin perpetuated many of these ideas at the time of the Reformation, and they are disseminated in Protestantism as well as in Catholicism. What comes through these Christian writings is a deep sadomasochism, sadism towards woman in general, masochism because this preoccupation with sexual sin and guilt led men and women to cultivate a quite unnecessary, almost hysterical sense of sin, guilt, and self-blame. It may be that this unconscious sense of guilt and self-blame that still prevents women from leaving abusive and violent partners and still sees them presented in the media as predominantly sexual objects, who, on losing their sexual attractiveness, are no longer of any interest to society. The anger and distrust held in deeply unconscious memories may also contribute to the mutual struggle for control and the consequent breakup of relationships between men and women, which costs the state $44 billion a year in the UK and causes children enormous distress. The meta-narrative of the myth of the fall, which has such deep roots in the solar age, cast a negative pall over the Christian attitude towards life in this world. Instead of helping to alleviate human suffering, it has immeasurably increased it. Culturally, it contributed to man's contempt for women's hysteria and emotionality, and strengthened the prejudice which for centuries barred her access to education and an effective place in the world in any of the professions exercised by men, including the priesthood and the medical profession. Until very recently in the United Kingdom, it underlay the judicial opinion in rape trials that women had asked for it. It has wounded man's internalized image of woman and given him a good reason for mistrusting and dissociating himself from his own feelings, as well as giving rise to an obsessive need to control them. In the political sphere, we are confronted by the violent history of Christianity, which is contrasted so strangely with the teaching of Christ, who spoke of love and compassion and our sonship with God, even of the innate divinity of all humanity. Ye are gods, John 10:34, as well as the need to love our enemies and forgive those who do us harm. We didn't really need any other direction than to follow the golden rule that we should do unto others as we would be done by, that compassion should be our guide. What happened to that luminous value in the brutal treatment of women, the sexual abuse of children, the persecution of heretics, the bloody conquests in the name of Christianity, the inquisitions, tortures, burnings, and the repression of any group or individual who threatened the established church? Where is it in contemporary evangelical Christian belief in the rapture, which envisages the elect being taken to heaven in end days and the rest left to perish, an idea that originates with St. Augustine's theory of predestination? Christianity today has become splintered by schisms and bitter arguments over the issue of women priests and homosexuality. Words from the Old Testament that were believed to enshrine divine revelation, written well over 2,000 years ago in a culture utterly different from our own, are invoked to support entrenched prejudices. The actual teaching of Christ about love and forgiveness appears to have been overlooked. Nor can we ignore the quite unwarranted sense of the moral and spiritual superiority of Christians towards other religions, their attempt to convert people to the true religion, and the omnipotent control exercised by the Church over its flock. Indigenous peoples in the New World were regarded as inferior, primitive, and close to nature, therefore rightly subjected to the superior power of the white European conquerors and needing to be converted to their religion. We have also to recognize the long-term effects of the expulsion of the Moors from Spain and the crusades against the Muslim infidel, which are carried right through to our own time in the unresolved tension between Christianity and Islam that lurks beneath the war on terror. We need to take into account attitudes to the body and sexuality and the belief that a life dedicated to God demanded the sacrifice of sexuality, and that this sacrifice was pleasing to him. The idea of atonement and reparation for evil that had long existed in the work of the Greek tragedians, but no one until the advent of Christianity had suggested that sexuality itself was a sin for which one had to atone. It may be this repression of an essential human instinct that has led over the centuries and into our own time, not only to male violence against women, but to the evil of pornography, which subjugates and violates woman's body, and to the abhorrent rape and sexual abuse of young boys and girls by Catholic priests who were entrusted with their care. One may wonder about the terrible traumas inflicted on children, which have been concealed for centuries and are now, thankfully, coming to light. No one is allowed to challenge the Catholic Church's rigid rules on contraception. It is strange that in a world where overpopulation is one of the major problems confronting our species and the earth itself, the Church still maintains the position on this issue, even in Africa, where, in the face of an AIDS epidemic that is destroying countless millions of lives, it counsels abstinence rather than the use of condoms, saying that condoms would lead to promiscuity. In South America and countries like the Philippines, where Catholicism is the predominant religion, women are told that it is their religious duty to deny themselves the help of contraception. Because of this, they are forced to bear too many children, far beyond their strength and ability to look after them. These children, sometimes 10 or more in a family, living in the favelas or shanty towns of South America, in Brazil, and the poorer quarters of the Philippines, can barely survive and fall victim to drug dealers, sexual abuse, lack of access to education, and the deterioration of their health and happiness. Again, we find the control of woman's sexuality by celibate men at the root of this belief. What unconscious fear of and contempt for women lies behind this need for control? And why do women accept it unless they are afraid of divine punishment? How does this preposterous ruling on contraception contribute to the growth of the world's population? Dr. Jutta Rank-Heinemann, who holds the chair for religious history at Essen University, has written a book entitled Eunuchs for Heaven. In the introduction to her devastating critique of the Church's hostility towards sexuality and women, she deplores how a long historical process has transformed Christianity from what it was, or should have been, a religion founded on personal experience of the universally accessible love of God, in which the body has its natural and God-given place, into a regime imposed by an unmarried oligarchy on a subordinate and largely married majority. This has perverted the work of him from whom the Christians take their name. In contrast to the shadow aspect of Christianity described in these two chapters, there is the behavior of countless millions of Christians who, over 2 millennia, have tried to live the essential message of Christ in innumerable acts of compassion and in the courageous defense of others in the face of the threat of their own death, in attempts to establish justice for the downtrodden and oppressed, and in setting up charities to help those less fortunate than themselves. Also, in contrast, is the legacy of sublime art, architecture, literature, and music, which arose in response to the inspiration of the life of Christ and his mother, and which I came to value deeply in the course of my quest. Conclusion. This chapter and the last have shown how the two great religious meta-narratives of the solar age in Western civilization, the myth of the fall and the doctrine of original sin, created a dualistic belief system that split nature from spirit and body from mind and soul. In their attempt to explain the existence of sin, death, and evil, they taught generations of men and women that this world was a place of suffering, sin, and punishment, and that the spiritual life demanded the rejection of this world. These two chapters have explored a pathology which is deeply embedded in a religion that is now embraced by over 2 billion people. It constitutes an unconscious collective thought form which is extremely difficult to transform and heal because it is so deeply unconscious. Moreover, these meta-narratives are still being disseminated wherever Christianity is carried today, particularly in Africa. The whole edifice of Christian belief rests on the twin pillars of belief in the fall of man and the consequent need for our redemption by Christ's sacrificial death. It may be that from the time of St. Augustine, Christianity has taken a disastrous detour under the spell of a myth and the formulation of a doctrine that has nothing whatever to do with the actual teaching of Christ, which was about the transformation of consciousness rather than belief as the way to salvation. It has split man off from his instinctive soul, casting a heavy pall of guilt on his apparently depraved existence. It has removed responsibility from man, seeing his redemption as already accomplished by the sacrificial death of the Son of God, who becomes the ultimate scapegoat, who dies for humanity's sins. Nowhere in the myth of the fall do we find the celebration of the sacred nature of sexual love, nor do we find the recognition of nature as a sacred order of reality. On the contrary, expulsion from the Garden of Eden and the suffering of both man and woman in this world were presented as a divinely imposed punishment for the role of Adam and Eve in initiating the fall. We may well wonder what the effect on Christianity would be if the doctrine of original sin that has so wounded the soul were expunged from Christian teaching, and if the myth of the fall were interpreted as a metaphor for the birth of consciousness rather than the reason why we needed a redeemer, so freeing both soul and body from the heavy burden they have carried for some 1600 years. One of the most beautiful descriptions of the subtle body is to be found in the hymn of the robe of glory, or hymn of the pearl, as it is known. Believed to have been written by a Gnostic called Bardesanes, who lived in Edessa in the 3rd century AD, and originally translated by Mede, it tells the story of the soul taking leave of her father and mother in the heavenly realms, her descent into mortality, her lapse into forgetfulness of her divine origin, her receiving a message from the divine realms, her awakening and seizure of a pearl from the jaws of a great dragon or serpent, and her return to the source from which she came, where she is finally clothed in a robe of glory and received into the kingdom. The vibrant words of this short extract from the poem translated by Mede describe the soul clothed with the robe of glory, or body of light. My bright embroidered robe, which with glorious colours, with gold and with beryls, and rubies and agates, and sardonyxes varied in colour, and like the sapphire stone also were its manifold hues. I hastened that I might take it, and me too, my loved, urged on that I should run to meet it and receive it. And I stretched forth and received it. With the beauty of its colours I adorned myself, and in my royal robe, of brilliant colours I clothed myself therewith, and ascended to the gate of salutation and homage.
Chapter 7. The Myth of the Fall and the Doctrine of Original Sin. The Christian separation of matter and spirit, of the dynamism of life and the realm of the spirit, of natural grace and supernatural grace, has really castrated nature. The true spirituality which would have come from the union of matter and spirit has been killed. Joseph Campbell, The Power of Myth. In the light of the solar myth explored in the last chapter, I could now understand that the myth of the fall of man is the most dramatic and influential myth or meta-narrative of the solar phase of separation. In the book of Genesis, we find the story of our expulsion from a divine world and our fall into this world, a fall that was brought about by a woman, Eve, who disobeyed the command of God and brought death, sin, and suffering into being. From this myth there developed the belief that the whole human race was tainted by original sin. Yet this was never more than a belief, a myth, although it was presented and accepted as divinely revealed truth. If we look at it from the perspective of the evolution of consciousness, the whole myth, telling the story of Eve's temptation by the serpent, the disobedience of Adam and Eve, and their expulsion from the Garden of Eden, can be read as a metaphor that describes the painful stage of our separation from the matrix of nature, the Garden of Eden, out of which we have evolved. Expulsion from the garden is an accurate metaphor for the birth of the capacity for reflection and self-awareness, so relinquishing the more unconscious state of living purely instinctively. Inevitably, just as with our separation at birth from our mother, a sense of duality came into being as we lost the sense of participation in a primordial sacred order. Unfortunately, even tragically, the myth was taken as literally true as well as divinely revealed, and the Christian psyche was imprinted with the belief that human nature was fallen, cut off from God as a result of the sin of Adam and Eve, eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge and condemned to exile on earth. For nearly 2,000 years, Christians have been taught and have believed that their only chance of redemption was the doctrines and rituals of the Church and the saving grace of the sacrificial death of the Son of God. There was no salvation for those who were not Christians. A second meta-narrative, developing out of the myth of the fall of man, was the Christian doctrine of original sin, promulgated by St. Augustine in the late 4th century, a disastrous obsession with sin and guilt, a distrust of sexuality and the body, and the fear of God's punishment took root in the soul. There was a radical shift of focus as spirit was projected upon a distant deity in the sky, and no longer experienced as the invisible ground of the phenomenal world. Was it the emphasis given to these two beliefs that caused the Christian Church to change in the course of the first 4 centuries, from being a medium of transmission for the teaching of Christ to being an imperial power with absolute control over millions of its subjects? What is the origin of evil, of death, of suffering? This question perplexed the authors of the book of Genesis. It perplexed the formulators of Christian doctrine centuries later, and perplexes us still today. This chapter and the next will explore the influence of the two meta-narratives mentioned above, which attempted to answer this question. They are a critical exploration of what may be called the shadow aspect of Christianity, for, in giving them such emphasis, the Christian Church may have presented a negative, not to say a distorted view of life to its believers. The myth of the fall originates with the book of Genesis, but its influence continued to be diffused throughout Jewish, Christian, and even Islamic culture. For a very long time, it has been the primary myth which has guided religious teaching in the West. To focus on only one religion, there are over 2 billion Christians in the world today, nearly a third of the world's population, who will have absorbed from it the idea that a woman, Eve, was responsible for bringing death, sin, and suffering into the world, and that all humanity carries the bitter legacy of the fall. I believe that these two immensely powerful beliefs, so entwined with each other, have deeply wounded the Christian soul. They have wounded woman as well as man's image of woman, and man's image of the feminine aspect of his own nature. Indeed, I wonder whether it is possible to exaggerate the wounding effect they have had on the Western psyche and Western civilization as a whole. I cannot listen to the harsh, condemnatory words attributed to God in the book of Genesis, chapter 3, verses 8 to 19, without a sense of revulsion as well as deep compassion for the souls, particularly the souls of children, who have been or will be burdened by its oppressive message. In the book of Genesis, God says to Eve, "I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee." And God says to Adam, "Because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree, cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life." Genesis chapter 3, verses 6 to 17. For nearly 2,000 years, countless millions have assimilated the message of this cruel, rejecting, and judgmental image of God, and the heavy burden of original sin. These verses are often read out at Christmas, at the beginning of the story of the birth of Jesus, as if to explain why the human race needed to be redeemed by the birth of a Saviour and his sacrificial death. The literal interpretation of the myth. The literal interpretation of the myth and the belief that it was divinely revealed bequeathed to generations of Christians a legacy of sexual guilt, misogyny, and fear of God's anger. The more I read the documents of the Catholic and Protestant churches, which reflected this literal interpretation, the more I could see the immense harm that was done to the relationship between men and women in Western civilization. Further, it was a major cause of a profoundly negative view of life, and with it a rejection of the world and a widening of the solar split between spirit and nature, mind and body. I could see that its influence has ultimately contributed to our growing alienation from nature and our ruthless exploitation of the earth's resources. Since, in this myth, earth was designated a place of exile, punishment, and suffering, why should we respect it? Since we had been banished to this place of suffering, sorrow, toil, and death, it was inevitable that we should feel justified in exploiting it for our own benefit, and that, in our relationships with other people, other religions, we should seek to offload our own sense of guilt by punishing, attacking, or blaming others, projecting onto them the intolerable hair shirt of guilt. I think that it is not too much to say that the great sickness in Christian culture has been the fear of sexuality, the denigration and denial of the sensuous and the ecstatic, and the oppression and enforced subservience of woman. It could be said that the first mistake in Christian teaching was to disassociate the body and matter from spirit and from soul. The second was the belief that in order to gain the approval of God and ward off his anger and further punishment, we had to deny the sexual instinct, reject the body, and even inflict pain and suffering on it. In the name of the spiritual life, the body was made to endure every kind of mortification, including such sadomasochistic practices as starvation, flagellation, and the wearing of hair shirts and other instruments of pain. I can understand why the whole train of ideas arose, but I wonder whether in splitting nature from spirit, emptying nature of soul and contaminating the instincts with guilt and fear, Christian teaching, like Marduk in the Babylonian myth, hasn't split the wholeness of life and our wholeness in two. Taking this further, it seems to have ascribed all goodness to God and all evil to man, placing an intolerable burden of guilt on our shoulders. Following the paradigm of solar mythology, which conceived of a great cosmic battle between good and evil, the next step was to ascribe all good to the institution of the Church and all evil to the pagan gods or any group which offered a challenge to the Church's power, formulating the concept of the saved and the damned, and reserving hell and damnation for heretics and unbelievers. As St. Augustine said, laying the foundation for the Inquisition, error has no rights. How, I wondered, was it possible for the soul and the values of the heart to survive and flourish in the face of a belief system which did such violence to them? The actual teaching of Christ was neglected through the centuries of hair-splitting doctrinal disputes. Did Christianity take a wrong turning when it built the whole edifice of its doctrine on salvation through the sacrificial death of the Son of God, on the foundation of the myth of the fall and the doctrine of original sin? Was this what Christ would have wanted, or would he have been appalled by what was taught and done in his name? Joseph Campbell comments, "Our story of the fall in the garden sees nature as corrupt, and that myth corrupts the whole world for us. Because nature is thought of as corrupt, every spontaneous act is sinful and must not be yielded to. You get a totally different civilization and a totally different way of living according to whether your myth presents nature as fallen or whether nature is in itself a manifestation of divinity, and the spirit is the revelation of the divinity that is inherent in nature. Because these myths or meta-narratives stand at the beginning of our cultural inheritance, it is very difficult to become aware of the assumptions derived from them, let alone disempower them. Their relevance to us today is that the deeper layers of the soul, which, for tens of thousands of years, had known a life of participation in the life of the earth and the cosmos, through an instinctual awareness of the unity and sacredness of life, were now abruptly deprived of that experience. The older lunar mythology, where all life was imagined as the creation of the Great Mother, born from her cosmic womb in a great web of relationships and connections, was suppressed. The various mystery religions which had flourished under the Greek and Roman empires were suddenly declared anathema. Into the 4th century, by the order of the Emperor Theodosius, pagan temples like the magnificent temple of Artemis at Ephesus and the temple of Demeter at Eleusis had been destroyed, and pagan rites prohibited. In the 6th century, on the orders of the Emperor Justinian, the Platonic Academy in Athens that had survived for 1,000 years was closed down. Although elements of the older rituals were preserved and integrated into the new rituals, the Christian Church became the major instrument which delivered the coup de grace to the old order. Even now, incredibly, there are echoes of this old prejudice in the belief held by certain Christian priests that yoga should not be practiced by Christians because it is pagan. The myth of the fall, which was given prominence in the teaching of St. Paul and disastrous new importance by St. Augustine and the early Christian fathers, was deeply rooted in Jewish culture. It perfectly illustrates the change of state from lunar to solar culture, from unconscious participatory unity to separation, guilt, estrangement, and exile. The wholeness of the sacred order was, so to speak, broken by the development of the self-awareness that separated us from nature, and this evoked an unconscious sense of guilt. As a myth, it movingly describes our sense of isolation, exile, and abandonment, as we lost touch with the older way of experiencing life and embarked on a new phase in the evolution of consciousness. There is no more striking image of the sense of exile and loss than our expulsion from the Garden of Eden, at whose entrance an angel stands with a fiery sword barring our re-entry. It is worth listening to D.H. Lawrence and how he saw this tremendous change. Isn't fall and redemption quite a late and new departure in religion and in myth about Homer's time? Aren't the great heavens of the true pagans clean of the salvation ideas, though they have the rebirth idea? And aren't they clean of the fall, although they have the descent of the soul? The two things are quite different. In my opinion, the great pagan religions of the Aegean and Egypt and Babylon must have conceived the descent as a great triumph, and each Easter of the clothing in flesh as a supreme glory, and the Mother Moon who gives us our body as the supreme giver of the great gift, hence the very ancient Magna Mater in the East. This fall into matter, this entombment in the envelope of flesh, is a new and pernicious idea, arising about 500 BC into distinct cult consciousness and destined to kill the grandeur of the heavens altogether at last. This can be contrasted with another passage from his last poems, where he describes the still living participatory consciousness of the Etruscan way of life. Behind all the Etruscan liveliness was a religion of life. Behind all the dancing was a vision, even a science of life, a conception of the universe and man's place in the universe, which made men live to the best of their capacity, To the Etruscan all was alive, the whole universe lived, and the business of man was himself to live amid it all. He had to draw life into himself out of the wandering, huge vitalities of the world. The cosmos was alive like a vast creature. The whole thing was alive and had a great soul or anima, and in spite of one great soul, there were myriad roving, lesser souls. Every man, every creature and tree and lake and mountain and stream was animate and had its own peculiar consciousness. As we move into Christian culture, this lunar vision of life and the participatory consciousness which gave rise to it are increasingly lost to the European cultural tradition. It still survived in the peasant communities, where the older traditions and rituals connected people with the cycles of nature, and where the ancient worship of the Great Mother was transferred to the Virgin Mary. But in the sphere of Christian theology, the repudiation of the image of the goddess, and with it the significance and influence of a feminine dimension of the divine, was devastating, because a vital thread of connection to the past was severed. Whereas the Egyptian, Sumerian, Greek, and Roman goddesses had given both men and women clearly defined images of different aspects of the feminine to which they could relate. Christian culture, after the 4th century, offered only 3 role models of the feminine: the Virgin Mary, Eve, and Mary Magdalene. The image of the soul was carried by the Virgin Mary, the dangerous desirousness of the instinct by Eve, and the sinful sexuality by Mary Magdalene. There is a fundamental split between the soul personified by the Immaculate Conceiving and, from the declaration of the Papal Edict of 1854, the Immaculately Conceived Virgin Mary, and the body represented by the carnal Eve and Mary Magdalene, the fallen woman. It was through the far-reaching influence of this myth that we lost the wholeness of our being, and the awareness that the concept of the soul must include instinct and the life of the body. The Myth of the Fall. A Summary and Aide-Memoire. 1. Describes the experience of the birth of consciousness or self-awareness as a fall from unity and harmony. 2. Names Eve as the primary cause of original sin, and explains the presence of suffering, death, and evil in the world as due to her disobedience to God and leading Adam into sin through responding to the temptation of the serpent, Satan. 3. Provides the scriptural foundation for the misogyny of the patriarchal view of woman. 4. Reflects and reinforces the dualistic split between spirit and nature, mind and body, and between this fallen world and an original perfect world, untainted by sin, that we once inhabited, and from which we were expelled by God. 5. Associates sexuality with sin, shame, and guilt, seeing the body, in St. Augustine's words, as a hissing cauldron of lust. From his Confessions. The demythologizing of the goddess. The myth of the fall of man originates with the book of Genesis. The date of its appearance is not precisely known, but is thought to be around the 8th century BC. It may be that it was first formulated after some dire catastrophe had happened to the Jewish people, possibly the ethnic cleansing by the Assyrians of the entire population of Samaria, the northern province of Israel, circa 720 BC, or it may have been an attempt on the part of the priesthood of Yahweh to discredit and even eliminate the Canaanite religion, where the worship of the goddess Asherah played an important part in the life of women who appealed to her in the ordeal of childbirth. The serpent in Canaanite mythology was inseparable from the cult of the goddess. This myth subtly demoted the goddess, who was blamed for the catastrophe that had befallen Samaria. since we know that in the child a deep conviction of guilt may be formed when some trauma has been experienced in early life, we can apply this understanding to a group of people living at a specific historical time who had experienced a great catastrophe. According to the beliefs of the time, they interpret this in terms of a punishment visited on them by God for the sin of disobedience and the worship of false gods. The myth can be read as the story of the deliberate and effective demythologizing of the hated goddess by the priesthood of that time, and her demotion from a goddess to a woman, Eve, who was blamed for bringing suffering, death, and sin into the world. The title that Adam gives to Eve in this myth is actually the former title of the Great Mother, Mother of all living, a title also held by the Shekinah of Kabbalah. It is strange and surely significant that the Genesis myth takes the life-affirming images of the garden, the tree of life, and the serpent, all inseparable from the goddess in the mythology of the lunar era, and weaves them into a story about disobedience, fear, guilt, punishment, and blame. The Great Mother, giver of life and death, who once contained both the living and the dead within her being, now, astonishingly, as Eve, becomes the cause of death coming into the world, and the serpent once present with the goddess in the temple in Jerusalem as the great brazen serpent is now cursed by God, condemned to crawl on its belly and eat dust. Genesis chapter 3, verse 14. Whatever its origins and the reasons for the appearance of this myth, what we are listening to as we decode the imagery is a complete reversal of the lunar mythology of the goddess culture. We need look no further than this myth and the interpretation given to it by generations of theologians, priests, and rabbis, not only for the ideas which led to the loss of soul and the sense of living within a sacred order, but also for the misogyny which spread like a contagious virus through the three Abrahamic religions. As Jack Holland writes in his masterly analysis of the historical roots of misogyny, the hatred of women affects us in ways that no other hatred does, because it strikes at our innermost selves. It is located where the private and public worlds intersect. The history of that hatred may dwell on its public consequences, but at the same time, it allows us to speculate on why, at the personal level, man's complex relationship to woman has permitted misogyny to thrive. Ultimately, such speculation should allow us to see how equality between the sexes will eventually be able to banish misogyny and put an end to the world's oldest prejudice. An alternative interpretation. The myth says that Eve and Adam made the wrong choice, which brought disastrous consequences upon the human race, and that we have been punished for that primal act of disobedience to God. The myth was interpreted literally and negatively, yet we, in a later age, can understand it differently. The important idea that we have free will as well as responsibility for the choices we make is intrinsic to this myth. So while the myth does describe an abrupt loss of participatory consciousness, or, in the Platonic sense, a fall from a higher state of being, it can also be understood as describing the dawning of a new phase in the evolution of human consciousness, the birth of the conscious ego, and all that this difficult separation from the matrix of instinct entailed. As the story is currently interpreted, it is Eve's response to the serpent which initiates the change from unity and harmony in the divine world to a state of separation and estrangement in this one. Yet her actions could be understood as a story about responding to the prompting of instinct, of which the serpent is a primary representation, to move into a new phase in our evolution, losing touch with the participatory consciousness of the earlier time. From my experience as a Jungian analyst, I know that the appearance of snakes in dreams can signify regeneration, renewal, and the birth of a new phase of life, or a new attitude, as a previous unconscious state is relinquished. Yet, as a result of the traditional interpretation given to the myth, people who, over the centuries, have dreamed of snakes may have interpreted them as an image of seduction, temptation, and evil, even associating them with Satan and the devil. The birth of self-awareness entails the loss of unconscious and instinctive participation in an original state of unity. The separation from nature necessarily creates duality, awareness of ourselves as separate from our surrounding environment, awareness of duality reflected in all the pairs of opposites, most importantly the opposites of life and death. The loss of the participatory consciousness of the older state creates feelings of guilt and disorientation, which this myth brilliantly describes, carried in the idea that we made the wrong choice. But in reality, there is no primordial sin, no ongoing moral guilt. We did not make the wrong choice. There is, however, a tragic burden in the sense of our having been made to carry the guilt engendered by this myth, without comprehending how and why it arose, nor of being able to recognize it as a metaphor which describes, in the act of eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge, the birth of self-awareness and the separation of ego from instinct. Whether it was necessary for such a radical split to develop is debatable. It may be that the myth itself contributed to the split and became the foundation on which many later errors arose. The projection of unconscious guilt. In the deep unconscious of the modern psyche, however secular our society, we may still be influenced by this Christian meta-narrative, since, at the unconscious level, old beliefs and habits persist long after they are thought to have been discarded. If, over many centuries, people are indoctrinated with the idea that they are flawed or are born into a state of sin, they will try to get rid of this intolerable burden by projecting their unconscious feelings of guilt onto other groups or individuals. These are then named and attacked as being bad or evil and in need of punishment or elimination. Since both the guilt and the projection are held at a deeply unconscious level, whether in the individual or the collective psyche, the end result will be disconnected from the memory of the original imprinting. Applying this reasoning to the collective Christian psyche, it could be argued that the shadow aspect of Christianity, with its persecution of Jews, Muslims, pagans, and heretics, perceived as threatening to the power of the Church and its teaching, could be connected with the need to offload the unconscious guilt imprinted on the psyche by the myth of the fall. The need to punish is deeply tied into unconscious guilt. Added to this burden of guilt was the inwardly directed attack on the appetites of the flesh, practiced by so many ascetics who, thinking that suffering and pain inflicted on the body would bring them closer to God, tried to suppress their sexual instincts and ward off the attacks on the devil, often in the form of women tempting them to fornication, with horrendous deprivation and self-inflicted austerities. The belief that the body must be controlled, mortified, made to suffer for its desires, and in general brought into a relationship of subjection to the mind, is very deeply ingrained in the Christian psyche. A typical passage in Colossians, chapter 3, verse 5, urges people to put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. It would never have occurred to those practicing the severe austerities enjoined on them by such texts that the instincts they had repressed would return to attack them in the form of the obsessive fantasies that so plagued the desert fathers of early Christianity. To name these as assaults of the devil only led to further acts of repression and greater austerities. If evil is an element in the cosmic order, its power was immeasurably increased by the repression of sexuality and all that resulted from it. I was struck by this passage in a book called Beyond Geography, The Western Spirit Against the Wilderness by Frederick Turner, which sensitively explores how the pathology of the Western Christian psyche with its disastrous focus on conquest and conversion developed. It seems to me that aggression against the body, against the natural world, against primitives, heretics, all unbelievers, and the vain, tragic, pathetically maintained hope of thus winning a lost belief or paradise, this is the terrific burden Christian history has to bear. It is the classic reaction of those who have lost true belief, or who have been robbed of it, that they must insist with mounting strenuousness that they do believe, and that all others must as well. For as social psychologists have shown, if the bereft can thus succeed in harmonizing the world with themselves, then the inward gnawing doubt might be stopped, and the intolerable condition of spiritual inanition alleviated. Even now, we can see how easily negative shadow projections can be activated in our modern society against anyone designated an enemy and demonized as evil or a threat. We can see this scenario reanimated in the present polarization between good and evil on the political stage, where conviction of moral superiority has been claimed by one group and the blame for evil fixed on another. We can see it in fundamentalist Christianity as well as fundamentalist Islam. We can see it in the aggressive and polarizing behavior of rival political parties. We can see it in our compulsive addiction to develop more lethal weapons in order to deter a potential adversary or a future attack, without any apparent awareness of our own contribution to the proliferation of evil through the projection onto others of our unconscious aggression. Thousands of young men are sent to their deaths or carry lifelong trauma because of these unconscious projections. They are also reflected in the determined effort of the evangelical branch of Christianity to demonize homosexuality, because in the Old Testament it is named a sin, reflected in the comment of a woman on the possibility of a gay priest being ordained a bishop in 2004. That man is a beast. Understanding the myth in this sense could help to remove the guilt and need to project that guilt onto others, which has been imprinted on the Christian psyche by the interpretation given to the myth by Christian theologians, both Catholic and Protestant. It was their literal interpretation of the myth, as well as the myth itself, which deprived us of a life of participation in the deeper layers of the soul, and cut us off from our instincts as well as from the recognition of the sacredness of the life of nature. To me, this is a prime symptom of the pathology of the solar age, which has led man to treat nature, woman, and body as something unregenerate, far removed from himself, objects to be feared that he must control and dominate. The early Christian fathers, the obsession with sexuality, sin, and guilt. I was astonished to discover the effect of this myth on the early Christian fathers, Origen, Tertullian, Clement, Chrysostom, Jerome, Athanasius, Augustine, and others. What leaps out from their writings in the early documents of the Church up to the 4th century is their absolute obsession with the sin of the fall and with sexual guilt. As I read with mounting incredulity what they had written about this myth, I said to myself, what on earth was the matter with them, that they were more concerned with sexual guilt than with the teaching of Christ? Whence came their sexual neurosis? All were brilliantly gifted men in an intellectual sense. All were convinced that the sexual instinct was the main impediment to spirituality, and that their sexuality had to be sacrificed in order for them to become acceptable to God. All had a phobic terror of what they called the dark hole between feces and urine, the uncleanness of the womb, and the parts of shame. all, like Plato, regarded the body as the prison of the soul, and identified men with spirituality and rationality, and women with carnality and the irrational animal instincts. Origen, 3rd century AD, perhaps the most remarkable and prolific writer of them all, is said to have castrated himself. Nowhere is the pathological disassociation between soul and body in the religions of the solar age more clearly revealed than in their writings, and the endless theological debates about the nature of God. St. Augustine, AD 354 to 430, a most sensitive and outstandingly gifted man, as well as one who was strongly attracted to women, repudiated his partner of 15 years, whom he dearly loved and by whom he had a son, because of a socially desirable marriage arranged by his Christian mother. My mistress was torn from my side as an impediment to my marriage, and my heart, which clung to her, was torn and wounded till it bled. We don't hear what happened to her heart or that of their son, Adeodatus, given from God, who tragically died at the age of 16, shortly after his parents' parting. St. Augustine lost both his partner and his son within a year. This moving and revealing passage was written by him after his son's death. God effects some good in correcting adults when they are chastised by the sufferings and deaths of the children who are dear to them. Why should this not happen, since when the pain is past, it is as nothing to those to whom it happened, while those on whose account it happened will either be better men if they are corrected by their temporal disasters and decide to live better lives, or else they will have no excuse when they are punished at the future judgment if they refuse to direct their longings towards eternal life under the stress of this life's pain. Within 2 years of his separation from his mistress, Augustine had converted to Christianity, and, after discarding another mistress, had taken a vow of chastity, because he believed this state would be more pleasing to God than his arranged marriage. No doubt influenced by his Christian mother, who was delighted by his conversion, he identified sexuality with sin. Converting to Christianity necessitated for him the renunciation of his sexuality. From then on, for the Christian soul, as for the body, since the soul could take no trust or delight in the sexual expression of its life, the situation deteriorated still further. St. Augustine's theory of original sin became a standard doctrine of the Catholic Church from the Council of Carthage in AD 418. St. Augustine, Jack Holland writes, established the philosophical edifice that propped up the Christian view of the world, including its misogynistic vision. Augustine is one of the watershed personalities of history. He stands between the world of classical antiquity, which had endured for about 1,000 years, and that of Christian civilization. He is the first person from antiquity who revealed to us the turmoil of his interior world, as recorded in his remarkable work, Confessions. At the center of the turmoil of Augustine's search for God is the struggle between the desire of the flesh and striving of the will, the profound dualism that Augustine will incorporate into the very heart of Catholicism, using Plato's philosophical apparatus. His cry of anguish echoes that of St. Paul, but with a power and complexity the apostle could not match. Augustine's moving confessions, begun around the year 400 AD when he was 46, are saturated with a profound rejection and distrust of his body. In psychological terms, the will of his conscious mind, dedicated to God, was forcibly imposed on his instincts, with disastrous consequences for himself as well as for generations of Christians. Influenced by Greek and also, perhaps unconsciously, Manichaean ideas, he, like Plato, associated his body with the irrational lower instincts, believing that sexuality itself was a mortal sin. Projecting his own profound sense of sinfulness onto the hapless body of the whole of humanity, he believed it was a mass of sin, a massa peccati, and that the state of original sin meant that not only do we arrive in a state of sin when we are born, but that we are incapable of refraining from sinning. He saw the whole human race as the multitude of the damned because of original sin. From this miserable state, we can only be rescued by the grace of God, and then only those who were predestined to be so rescued. He struggled desperately to understand where evil came from, and because he believed that God must be wholly good and incorruptible, he concluded that evil must come from man, principally from his corruptible body that was subject to death. St. Augustine was not the originator of the theory of original sin. It had existed in the Jewish religion and was taught by St. Paul. Augustine refers to earlier Christian theologians who had expounded on it. However, the basic concept of the Augustinian version of the theory is that Adam was the originator of the fall of the human race, and, as its progenitor, who carried within himself all future generations, the transmitter of the contaminated seed of sinfulness to those generations. He believed that every child who was born into the world through sexual intercourse arrived in a state of sin that was carried forward as an inheritance from its primordial ancestor. By a kind of divine justice, the human race was handed over to the devil's power, since the sin of the first man passed at birth to all who were born by intercourse of the two sexes, and the debt of the first parents bound all their posterity. Sexual desire was thus transmitted like a genetic disease through the sexual act. Adam's sin had corrupted the whole of nature and made it subject to death, but the entire sorry story was initiated by Eve. In The City of God, he wrote that from the moment of the fall, the flesh began to lust against the spirit. With this rebellion we are born, just as we are doomed to die, and because of the first sin, to bear in our members and vitiated nature either the battle with or the defeat by the flesh. This is solar mythology at its most extreme, whose polarizing effect was enormously amplified by the identification of the body with sin and Augustine's own inner battle with his sexuality. The formulation of the doctrine of original sin arose out of St. Augustine's profound conviction of his own sexual sin and guilt. Through this doctrine, the love of God and the obedience to him were placed in opposition to the life of the body. The act of procreation perpetuated the transmission of original sin. Celibacy, or sexual abstinence, could restore the lost sense of primordial unity. Truly, by continence are we bound together, and brought back into that unity from which we were dissipated into a plurality. It is not difficult to imagine the effect of this Christian belief on the sexual relations between men and women. Even a man's passionate embrace of his wife was deemed to be sinful because it transmitted original sin. Nor is it difficult to understand that it was Augustine's savage crucifixion of his own sexual instinct and his passionate nature which gave rise to his distorted view of human nature and his interpretation of the origin of death, sin, and evil. The repudiation of his sexuality was echoed in his cruel repudiation of his mistress. It evidently did not occur to him that the devastating wound he inflicted on her and on their son might be by far the greater sin. St. Augustine immeasurably compounded a tragic situation that was already well established by earlier fathers of the Church. His theory of original sin became a foundation stone of Christian doctrine and has endured to this day. However, he gave this theory a new gloss. Grace is necessary for salvation, since without it we are condemned to remain irredeemably mired in a state of sin. St. Augustine's theory of original sin, predestination, and the need for grace did not go unchallenged. It was condemned by Pelagius, AD 354 to 418, and others. Pelagius was originally a priest in the Celtic Church, and later a respected theologian and teacher who lived in Rome and then Jerusalem. He wanted to lift the burden of original sin from the human race and took issue with St. Augustine over his interpretation, insisting that only Adam was affected by the sin that led to the fall. His beliefs may be stated as follows. 1. Original sin does not exist. 2. Infants are born in the same state of innocence as Adam before the fall. 3. Man is not dependent on Christ for redemption, nor is divine grace essential for redemption. 4. Redemption is earned through following Christ's example, not given through his sacrificial death. 5. The human race has free will and the capacity for choice and moral responsibility. 6. Man has the potential to realize the divine element within his nature, to become Christ-like. He insisted that human nature was innately good because it was created by God, and denied that salvation could only come about through belonging to the Church. Pelagius is like a breath of fresh air in the midst of Augustine's morbid obsession with sin. The great doctrinal struggle between them gives us the image of two powerful stags locking antlers. Pelagius was declared a heretic in 417 and died a year later, and Augustine's pessimistic and guilt-laden doctrine passed into church law in 418. Another man, Julian, Bishop of Eclanum in Italy, sided with Pelagius against Augustine, and, writing in a letter to Augustine himself of his strong objection to his conviction that original sin affects infants, said, "Babies, you say, carry the burden of another's sin, not any of their own? Explain to me, then, who is this person who sends the innocent to punishment? You answer, God. God, you say, the very one who commends his love to us, who has loved us and not spared his Son, but handed him over to us. He judges us in this way. He persecutes newborn children. He hands over babies to eternal flames. It would show a just and reasonable sense of propriety to treat you as beneath argument. You have come so far from religious feeling, from civilized standards, so far indeed from common sense, that you think your Lord capable of committing kinds of crime which are hardly found among barbarian tribes." Strong words indeed. Had Pelagius and the group of dissenting bishops led by Julian won the fiercely debated doctrinal battle with St. Augustine, the history of Christianity might have been very different. We may, centuries later, regret that this could not be. We might have been spared the virulent theological struggles for power and the neurotic preoccupation with sin and sexuality and the mistrust of women that bedevil the Christian church to this day. We might also have been spared the Manichaean polarization of humanity into the saved and the damned, carried right through to our times in Christian fundamentalist beliefs about the rapture in the end times, when God takes to heaven those who are predestined to be saved and leaves the rest to perish. Further, we might have been spared the tortures and executions that went with the belief that it was God's will that the Church should seek out and extirpate sin and heresy wherever it could be found, since heresy, as a disruption of the divine order, could bring down God's wrath on the whole community. This perceptive passage from a recent book by Charles Freeman, called AD 381, Heretics, Pagans, and the Christian State, is worth quoting at length. Augustine's lasting contribution to political thought lies in his justification of authoritarian regimes that see virtue in order per se, rather than in any abstract ideal, such as justice for the defense of human rights, or even in the teachings of Jesus themselves. At a stroke, Augustine supplants centuries of Greek thought, which viewed the government of the city primarily in terms of the well-being of its citizens. Moreover, when church and state become mutually supportive in the upholding of order, then the punishment of heretics becomes a matter of state policy. This would be the norm in medieval Europe. Augustine's underlying premise that there is a single truth that can only be grasped through faith, that human beings are helpless, that God is essentially punitive, ready to send even babies into eternal fire, and that one has the right, even duty, to burn heretics. This premise challenges the whole ethos of the Greek intellectual tradition, where competition between rival philosophies was intrinsic to progress. The freedom to speculate freely as an individual had no place in this system. He was terrified by the idea that all might contribute to the finding of truth. Augustine bequeathed a tradition of fear to Christianity, fear that one's speculations might be heretical, and fear that even if they were not, one might still go to hell as punishment for the sin of Adam. Such was the effect of the repression, not the control, of his sexual instinct, a very brilliant, passionate, and sensitive man, that he was able to manifest in a complex strong enough to direct a church for centuries, and to lead to the deaths of thousands of individuals whose only sin was to be accused of heresy. The idea of heresy was first introduced by the Emperor Theodosius in AD 381, when anyone who did not comply with his edict that all must believe in the doctrine that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit were of one and the same substance would be declared a heretic. The end result of Theodosius's policy was the persecution not only of heretics, but of the pagan religions, and the destruction of their shrines and magnificent temples. It was at this time that the idea entered Christianity that hell and eternal punishment awaited heretics and unbelievers. Augustine himself later sanctioned the burning alive of heretics as an appropriate punishment for their sin. From this time on, the idea developed that the Catholic Church, backed by the emperor, should have absolute authority and control of the lives of its members. The Church took over the model of absolutism that had been presented to it by the emperor ever since it became associated with the imperial policy of the Roman state in the reign of Constantine, circa AD 272 to circa 337, where, in this reign of terror, was the compassion that Christ emphasized in his teaching. It is in the crucially important 4th century that the Catholic Church appears to have been deflected from the path to God as taught by Christ and the early Church, and became contaminated by the pursuit of Caesar's power. The concept of original sin and the belief that the Catholic Church was the only path to salvation gave it immense power over the lives of millions of believers, in whom it instilled a fear of hell-fire and purgatory. Vivid scenes painted on the walls of churches during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance showed the fate that awaited sinners if they transgressed the rules laid down by the Church. It could be argued that the pursuit of power and the growing authoritarianism of the Catholic Church, from the 13th to the 18th centuries, when the power of the Inquisition was at its height, led directly to the horrors of the totalitarian states of the last century. The behavior of the Church created a precedent for these horrors, a precedent made more powerful because it was practiced by the highest religious authority. Through its 500-year pursuit of heretics through this office, the Church demonstrated how a carefully thought out and minutely organized policy, using intimidation, censorship, torture, and terror as its tools of power, could offer a model of ensuring conformity of belief among vast numbers of people. Nothing reflects the pathology that had such an iron grip on the Christian psyche more than these sacrificial rituals executed in the name of God. The negative legacy of St. Augustine. The doctrine of original sin inflicted a deep wound on the Western psyche. It was a catastrophe not only for sexuality in general, but for woman, who was held to be the prime carrier of the lower animal instincts. As Karen Armstrong writes in her History of Misogyny in the Christian Church in The End of Silence, Women and the Priesthood, sin, sex, and woman were bound together in an unholy trinity in the Western Christian imagination by the powerful theology of St. Augustine. Sexual intercourse was declared to be only for the purpose of procreation, never for pleasure. Woman was not to be regarded as the beloved companion of man, but only as a kind of useful functionary, the bearer of his seed and provider of his meals. If possible, couples were to live in chastity within marriage. In the view of the Church Fathers, the only way a woman could gain man's respect was to remain a virgin. If men chose the spiritual life, they could not allow themselves to be defiled by intercourse with women. In the 4th and 5th centuries, virginity was the Christian virtue par excellence. Because infants were contaminated from the moment of their conception by the transmission of original sin from their parents, if they died without being baptized, their souls could not be saved and were consigned to limbo. One can imagine the effects of this doctrine on parents who had lost a child. From this twisted belief, the Catholic Church developed the idea, which survived until very recently, that if it came to a choice of saving one or other in childbirth, it was more important to save the life of the unbaptized infant than the life of its mother, in order that the infant should receive baptism. The suffering generated by this belief is unimaginable and indefensible. The belief about the sinfulness of sexuality also led to the idea that a priest or deacon who serves God must be celibate, and to many attempts by the Church to enforce celibacy on its clergy. Most of them were unsuccessful. The underlying fear was that sexual contact with a woman would defile the holy sacraments. The earliest attempts date to a council held in Spain in the 4th century, when married priests were enjoined to avoid intercourse with their wives. Pope Gregory the Great, who died in 604 AD, decreed that a priest once ordained should love his wife like a sister and shun her like an enemy. Pope Gregory VII in the 11th century called for severing intercourse between priests and women by means of everlasting anathema. Finally, in 1139, Pope Innocent II proclaimed that ordained priests could not marry. A few centuries later, the Council of Trent, 1545-63, forbade men who were already married from becoming priests. A sombre reflection on the legacy of St. Augustine is offered by the late Philip Sherard in his perceptive book, The Rape of Man and Nature. I am quoting Sherard at some length because he shows how differently we might have perceived ourselves. It is one of the paradoxes, and also one of the tragedies of the Western Christian tradition, that the man who affirmed so strongly the presence of God in the depths of his own self should, as a dogmatic theologian, have been responsible more perhaps than any other Christian writer for consecrating within the Christian world the idea of man's slavery and impotence due to the radical perversion of human nature through original sin. It has been St. Augustine's theology which, in the West, has veiled down to the present day the full radiance of the Christian revelation of divine sonship, the full revelation of who man essentially is. He deprives the element of manhood in the God-manhood reality of any genuine positive quality, and to do this is to empty the concept of divine sonship of its effective significance. Through the fall, man and the natural order are deprived of even that extrinsic participation in grace, which they possessed in their pre-fallen state. Their original and true nature is now vitiated, totally corrupt and doomed to destruction. As for the communication of grace, through which alone man and the world may be redeemed from depravity, this was confined to the visible church, and depended on the performance of certain rites, like baptism, confirmation, ordination, and so on, which it was the privilege of the ecclesiastical hierarchy to administer to a submissive and obedient laity. The magnificent scope of the Logos doctrine, with its whole cosmic dimension, the idea of God incarnate in all human and created existence, was tacitly and radically constricted in Western thinking. The Church became the unique sphere of the Spirit's manifestation. Everything outside the limits of the Church was secular, deprived of grace, incurably corrupt, and doomed to disintegration. The Logos doctrine, outlined above, which derived from Plato, could have kept alive the participatory consciousness of the lunar era and taken it to a new and conscious level of relationship with the cosmos, and the recognition that the whole earthly order of reality was intrinsically divine, because it existed within the being of God. It seems a tragedy for Western Christianity that this insight was lost. St. Augustine can be described as a world-denying contemplative, rather than a world-embracing one. The stance he took against his own desires was agonizing for him, and for generations of Christians. Yet his struggle with himself must be seen in the context of the world of his time, and the widening split between conscious mind and the instinctive soul. In spite of my recognition of the deep wound he inflicted on the Christian psyche, I am always deeply moved by these words in one of the most exquisite passages to come from the heart of a lover of God. Too late I came to love thee, O thou beauty, both so ancient and so fresh. Yea, too late came I to love thee, and behold, thou wert within me, and I out of myself, where I made search for thee. The core Christian belief is that humanity is so steeped in depravity and sin that only the sacrifice of the Son of God could redeem it. 6 centuries after St. Augustine, St. Anselm, A.D. 1033 to 1109, an Italian priest who became Archbishop of Canterbury, wrote in his meditation on human redemption, "A man appended to a cross suspends the eternal death impending over the human race. A man fastened to a cross unfastens a world affixed to endless death." Those who did not belong to the Church were thought to be consigned to this endless death. With the Reformation, when some change might have been expected, both Luther and Calvin continued to base their teaching on the doctrine of original sin and the need of redemption by Christ's sacrificial death because of it. Both saw woman's role as confined to childbearing and obeying her husband. The phrase, "a woman's place is in the home," originated with Luther. If anything, the sense of guilt and sin was augmented by Luther and Calvin, and the subjection of sinful humanity to the will of a fearful, ever-vigilant, and punishing God perpetuated. Calvin sent to the stake the brilliant Spanish scientist, doctor, and theologian Michael Servetus, who was the first European scientist to discover the pulmonary circulation of the blood. Servetus had dared to challenge Calvin's institutes and reject his teaching on original sin and human depravity. It seems that men like Calvin were so saturated by these beliefs that it was impossible to separate themselves from them, as D.H. Lawrence was to write so powerfully in Lady Chatterley's Lover. The Christian religion lost, in Protestantism finally, the togetherness with the universe, the togetherness of the body, the sex, the emotions, the passions, with the earth, sun, and stars. In their literal belief in the myth of the fall, generations of theologians and priests taught men and women that this world was a fallen one that could only be redeemed by the sacrificial death of the Son of God. Secondly, they warned men not to trust women, and women not to trust themselves or each other. Matthew Fox observes in his book, Original Blessing, that the doctrine of original sin can itself contribute to sin, and above all, to distrust of life. A devastating corollary of the fall redemption tradition is that religion with original sin as its starting point, and religion built exclusively around sin and redemption, does not teach trust. Such a religion does not teach trust of existence, or of body, or of society, or of creativity, or of cosmos. It teaches both consciously and unconsciously, verbally and non-verbally, fear. Fear of damnation, fear of nature, beginning with one's own. Fear of others, fear of the cosmos. In fact, it teaches distrust beginning with distrusting of one's own existence, one's own originality, and one's own glorious entrance into this world of glory and of pain. Through my work as a therapist, I found that the belief in original sin and a profound rejection of woman, the body, and sexuality, as well as the deep sense of self-rejection that are intrinsic to it, are still carried in the unconscious psyche of Western men and women, no matter how much they may have adapted to a secular culture. From a Jungian perspective, man's anima, the unconscious, internalized image of woman that he carries in his psyche, has been imprinted with the image of Eve and the Christian teaching on original sin. This may cause him to fall back on old beliefs about woman's inferiority and subservience whenever he feels threatened in his relationships with women. It may also be responsible for the negative view of themselves that many women hold and the difficulty they still have in establishing themselves in professions hitherto open only to men, or in leaving abusive relationships. These old beliefs manifest in the debasement and abuse of women, displayed in pornography and in rap lyrics, as well as in the revolting trade of trafficking women and the devastating and widespread use of rape as a weapon of war. The current obsession with sex, promiscuity, and pornography that is now so much a part of modern Western culture on the underlying stratum of misogynistic beliefs inherited from the past. If anything, it perpetuates and reinforces them. Woman is still demeaned by being presented in the tabloid press as a sexual object for the gratification of man's sexual desire, where neither her family offer her any protection, may become the victim of predatory males. We now have to deal with the additional problem of organized pedophilia, which also points to the presence of an unconscious sexual compulsion. All this has inflicted a devastating wound on the Christian psyche. It is a powerful thought form or complex that has not been recognized and addressed, and therefore cannot be transformed.
Wherever evangelical Christianity is taken, the teaching about original sin and fall redemption theology goes with it, wounding the souls of all who are converted to Christianity. Just when it seemed as if modern Christians might be emerging from the stranglehold of this complex, fundamentalist branches of Christianity in America and in Africa are regressing into it, activating the old belief in the inferior and subservient nature of woman. A recent statement by President Carter, July 2009, explains why he decided to leave his Baptist church. This is an extract from his statement.
I have been a practicing Christian all my life and a deacon and Bible teacher for many years. My faith is a source of strength and comfort to me, as religious beliefs are to hundreds of millions of people around the world. So my decision to sever my ties with the Southern Baptist Convention after 6 decades was painful and difficult. It was, however, an unavoidable decision when the convention's leaders, quoting a few carefully selected Bible verses and claiming that Eve was created second to Adam and was responsible for original sin, ordained that women must be subservient to their husbands and prohibited from serving as deacons, pastors, or chaplains in the military service. This view that women are somehow inferior to men is not restricted to one religion or belief. Women are prevented from playing a full and equal role in many faiths, nor, tragically, does its influence stop at the walls of the church, mosque, synagogue, or temple. This discrimination, unjustifiably attributed to a higher authority, has provided a reason or excuse for the deprivation of women's equal rights across the centuries.
It is hardly surprising that so many people have rejected the dogmatic excesses of religion and turned with relief to science and a secular society.